Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and friends all. My name's Ian Satchwell, and it's my honour to be the Director of the International Mining for Development Centre. And it's my great pleasure on behalf of AusAid and IM4DC to welcome you to Sydney for this special event, the second International Mining for Development Conference. Welcome, welcome to you all. I would like to acknowledge that today we are meeting on Aboriginal land, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Shortly, we will have a special welcome to country, as is our custom at such events as these. I would like to acknowledge the presence of Auntie Millie Ingram, who will deliver the welcome and who I will introduce to you shortly. I would also like to acknowledge a number of other special guests that we have here today or who will arrive shortly. We have ministers and parliamentary secretaries from a range of our partner countries: Afghanistan, Uganda, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Germany, Myanmar, Guatemala, Madagascar, the Philippines, a little later on when they get off their plane, from Nigeria, and of course from Australia. We also have senior representatives of donor organisations who are working in extractives for development from Canada, Great Britain, Germany and Norway. Plus we have senior representatives here from the World Bank. And Claire Short, the chair of EITI, will be here to talk with us tomorrow. And we have senior representatives from leading organisations in civil society, the mining industry, education, and other organisations. Just in case I've missed anyone, one of the things that I have learned in my time at the International Mining for Development Centre is the wonderful African catch-all, and that is all protocols observed. So that means all of you are acknowledged and welcome. Our theme is maximising benefits for communities, because in the end, mining for development is about growing economies sustainably, helping people out of poverty, and ensuring that the benefits of mining are spread equitably right through our communities. This conference brings together a wide range of international and Australian expertise to discuss, debate, and hopefully answer some of the fundamental questions relating to mining for development. Over the next 2 days, we have some 60 eminent speakers, ranging from ministers to industry practitioners, government officials, civil society and community representatives, educators and researchers. And we will also hear from some of our eminent IM4DC alumni, and there are now more than 900 of them. Originally, we thought that maybe 300 people might come to this conference, but we found out a few months ago that we'd rather gone over 300, so we had to change venues to accommodate 500, and now we have more than 600 people registered for this conference. So we are very honoured that you could all come. And the 600 of you come from an amazing 69 countries around the globe, all with a great interest in extractives and mining for development. So I say congratulations on making it to Australia, to Sydney, and into this hall. Looking upstairs, it's a little more crowded than many conference venues that you may have been to, but do look on the bright side. The interaction is going to be even more intense than usual. This journey is going to be about discussion and collaboration, debate, forming networks with each other and learning together how to improve outcomes in our respective sectors, focusing on communities. Now, before I go on, I need to cover off some what we call housekeeping matters. And the first one is I will turn my phone to silent, and please do also too. But we don't necessarily want you to turn your phone off, because you are very welcome to tweet. And the hashtag is M4D conference, M4D conference. Please tweet your views, and they will be going up live. We won't put them on the screen, but they will be going up live on our website, and you'll be able to follow the conversation during the 2 days of this conference. Now, very importantly, emergency evacuation procedures. In Australia, as in many other countries, we have 2 alarm sounds. The first one is the standby alarm, and that is a, I'll try and do this, beep, beep, beep. Just stay where you are and await instructions. But then, if we hear the whoop, whoop, whoop sound, do you like that? If you hear the whoop, whoop sound, then we need to evacuate this building. In this hall, there are emergency exits on the lower level over to my right, your left, and behind you. Upstairs, there are 3 emergency exits, over here, and at the back. They all take you out onto the street. There will be, in the building above us, there are about 3,000 people working, so you will not be without people to follow. But where we go is up Castlereagh Street, the street from which you entered this building. Go up to your left, up to the corner near the Commonwealth Bank. That is the muster point. If you're in doubt, follow the ushers. They have all been instructed on the emergency evacuation procedures. If you need the bathroom or toilets, just out the back door here to your left, and they're on other levels as well. Morning and afternoon tea will be served directly outside in the foyer where you were gathering before you came in here. There is a business centre available for your use, and there is an information desk. And importantly, for French-speaking people, we have translators here, and you can get a headset if you have not already from the information desk to hear the translation of proceedings into French or any French presentations into English. If you require wireless internet, we all require wireless internet these days, in your program is the log-on detail. It is free. And finally, please note, there are feedback forms in your satchels, and we would love to hear from you at the end of the conference, your views on how the conference has gone and any suggestions you have for improvements for our conference next year. Now, before we begin our journey through our substantial and exciting agenda, I would like to introduce Auntie Millie Ingram, a senior Aboriginal elder for this area, who I know has spent a lot of time very locally. There's a step there, Millie, and will give us a very special welcome to country. Please welcome Auntie Millie Ingram.
Thank you, Ian. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have been invited here this morning, and it is my pleasure today to give you a warm and sincere welcome to the land of the Gadigal people, Aboriginal land. I acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which we stand. The Eora Nation is bounded around Sydney by the 3 great rivers surrounding Sydney, the Hawkesbury to the north, the Nepean to the west, and the Georges River to the south, and of course the Pacific Ocean to the east. There are 29 clans of Aboriginal people within this Eora Nation. I acknowledge all of our elders, past and present. Australian governments and corporates recognise Welcome to Country as a very important protocol practiced by my people for thousands and thousands of years. It is a wonderful protocol that I believe brings us closer together as a nation of Australia. I'm always happy to do the welcome, as it is in accordance with my commitment to process of reconciliation between us as the first Australians with our fellow Australians. There has been a gap between us for far too long, and it must be closed. Aboriginal people have the distinction of being the first Australians within this great country of ours, together with some 230 other nationalities that have settled here over the past 225 years. That makes up the wonderful tapestry of our society. Wherever you are from across the city, across the state, or across our nation, or from across the globe, I welcome you here to Gadigal land. I would like to take this opportunity to ask that all mining companies to observe the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples. We need mining in our country for economic reasons, but meaningful negotiations should also occur with Indigenous traditional owners and the people who own and work on the land, farmers and graziers. I would also like you to think about the devastating effect the dumping of nuclear waste near the homelands of my people where they live in the Northern Territory is not acceptable. You should be requesting governments not to do this. Some of my Aboriginal people live in abject poverty in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Economic development should not only be for governments but also to the Indigenous people who own the land and to the farmers who work and own their land. I believe we can all coexist in our country, in any country, as long as there is equitable returns from mining development to traditional owners as well as governments. I hope you are enjoying your visit to Sydney, to our wonderful city, with the wonderful weather we have been providing for you. May I wish you all a safe journey back to your homelands, good health and happiness for yourselves and your families. I hope you have a wonderful day, and may you always walk in safety while you still walk on Gadigal land. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Millie Ingram, and thank you for a right-on-topic message. And I came from a workshop organised by Oxfam only last Friday that some of us were at, talking about free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous people for mining. So your intervention is very timely. Thank you. Okay, now it is my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, who is the Honourable Dr. Andrew Leigh MP, Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. And you saw our Prime Minister and her signature on the screen a little earlier. Prior to being elected in 2010 as the federal member for Fraser, Andrew Leigh was a Professor of Economics at the Australian National University. Andrew has written extensively on a range of subjects, including education, taxation and social policy, but I think with always an economic twist to that. He writes regularly for the Australian media. He holds a PhD in public policy from Harvard and graduated from the University of Sydney with first-class honours in law and arts. He's previously worked as a lawyer and as principal advisor to the Australian Treasury. Andrew is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences. He is the only parliamentarian in Australia to be elected as a Fellow of one of the 4 national academies. Not only that, in 2010, Andrew was recognised as a very eminent economist because he received the Young Economist Award, a prize given every 2 years by the Economic Society of Australia to the best Australian economist under 40. So Andrew is not only from his position well qualified to talk to us, but also from his skills and experience. Please welcome the Honourable Dr. Andrew Leigh.
Thank you, Ian, for that very generous introduction. It does tell you something about the economics profession, doesn't it, when our definition of young is under 40. But I am, by that definition, no longer young, I'm afraid. I'd like to, as Ian has done, welcome you this morning to the Mining for Development Conference on behalf of both the Resources Minister, Gary Gray, and the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Bob Carr. As Auntie Millie did, I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to thank Auntie Millie for her important and challenging welcome to country. I'd like to thank those of you who've travelled a long way to be here today, including elected representatives from Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America and the Pacific, and leaders from civil society, academia and industry. And just this morning I've enjoyed conversations with the ministers of mines from Madagascar, Afghanistan and Bougainville. I want to particularly acknowledge my friend and parliamentary colleague Kirsten Livermore, who's in the front row here in the white. Kirsten is the federal member for Capricornia in Queensland, and she's somebody who has been in Parliament 12 years longer than me, and somebody who I really look to as a mentor and exemplar of a great parliamentarian. Kirsten's got a particular interest in mining in Mongolia, a country she's visited 3 times in the past 4 years. Any Mongolian speakers in the audience are welcome to test their Mongolian on Kirsten during the coffee break. And she tells me that over that time she's seen major improvements in infrastructure and skills. Average incomes in Ulaanbaatar have risen, but inequality's risen too. Rio Tinto is working hard to meet the Mongolian government's expectation that the benefits of the giant Oyu Tolgoi mine are spread across the Mongolian population. And AusAid is working in Mongolia on development challenges, such as managing the competing demands for water resources. And those similar challenges confront parliamentarians in Australia, like Kirsten and me, as we work with mining communities right across this country. Let me start with the Australian mining story. When Edward Hargraves announced in 1851 that he had found gold in Bathurst, it started an avalanche. Over the next decade, the Australian population tripled and Australian income quadrupled as people flooded in from across the globe to take advantage of Australia's mineral wealth. And it's not much of an exaggeration to say that central Melbourne today is largely a product of those 19th century gold rushes, which continued until the late 1800s. If you go to Melbourne, you'll see the Royal Exhibition Building, opened in 1880. It was modelled on the Duomo in Florence. And by the end of the 19th century, Australians enjoyed the highest living standards in the world. And while our 19th century mining boom was driven by supply, our most recent mining boom's been driven by demand. The past decade has seen world commodity prices triple. The terms of trade for Australia recently reached a 140-year high. Urbanising China and India need steel to make their skyscrapers, and Australia happens to be the world's biggest producer of iron ore and a major producer of coking coal. Our iron ore exports from Australia are 4 tonnes a second, which means that in the time you've been in this building, Australia has exported the weight of this building in iron ore. Australia has the largest demonstrated resources of mineral sands, of coal, of uranium, of nickel, of zinc and lead. Australia is also among the world's top 6 in bauxite, copper, gold, iron ore and industrial diamonds. According to Treasury official David Gruen, while the mining and mining-related sectors constitute only 1/5 of the Australian economy, they have in recent years contributed more than 2/3 to Australia's economic growth. So it's a major structural shock that's hit the Australian economy, but compared to the 1970s terms of trade shock, the benefits of this mining boom are flowing more broadly through the community. Inflation is low, unemployment is below the levels in most developed nations. Even the dispersion of unemployment across communities has fallen. We've shifted policy settings too, moving from the old royalty regime to a profits-based mining tax means that when prices go up, tax revenue goes up too. And in an environment where parts of the non-mining sector are suffering from Dutch disease, this seems a reasonable approach. Through the mining boom, Australia's benefited from having highly skilled industry professionals, cutting-edge technology, world-leading infrastructure, welcoming investment regimes, and strong links to important export markets. The Australian government's working with industry and Indigenous communities to create much-needed employment and economic opportunities. In fact, the Australian government and the Minerals Council of Australia have had a memorandum of understanding in place since 2005 that seeks to do exactly this. It focuses on helping workers obtain driving licences and housing, raising literacy, helping Indigenous people make the transition to school and to work. Mining jobs matter, but because mining is so capital intensive, they can't be the only way in which the benefits of a mining boom are shared across the community. So in my view, Australia has an obligation to share our mining experience with developing nations and to work with multinational organisations such as the United Nations, the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank. Or to put it another way, as Anne said, I approach everything with the lens of an economist, Australia has a comparative advantage in managing natural resources programs through our foreign aid. And like Australia, many developing countries are well endowed with natural resources. But you all know about the so-called resource curse, the fact that developing nations who have more natural resources tend to have lower growth rates, tend to perform more poorly on indicators of democracy. And the resource curse arises because mineral endowments are easier for non-democratic leaders to expropriate than incomes derived from other sources, such as farming, industry, services. You can see the curse, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country whose extraordinary mineral wealth has more often been a source of conflict than a wellspring of prosperity. And the DRC's troubled history reflects the challenge of ensuring that minerals benefit the entire population. In developed nations, oil and mineral assets generally raise living standards across the board. But the term resource curse was coined because of the tendency for developing nations with natural resources to grow more slowly than those without natural resources. Now, some developing countries have avoided the resource curse, but on average, the paradox holds. Natural resources generally fail to help poor countries grow rich. And my thinking on this is greatly shaped by the great Oxford economist Paul Collier, who we're very fortunate to have with us here today. Paul and I had a terrific dinner at Parliament House a couple of years back, and pretty much everything I might say on this topic goes back to that dinner. Paul points out that if we can help developing countries make better use of their natural resources, the resulting fiscal flows could help societies to transform themselves for the better. And in fact, if developing countries can benefit from their minerals, then the payoff could dwarf anything we might hope to deliver through foreign aid. Paul points out that in rich countries, where geologists have carefully surveyed the land, the typical square kilometre has subsoil assets worth $114,000. So every square kilometre of the typical rich country has subsoil assets worth $114,000. And in all probability, the same is true across the developing world. If that's the case, then Africa's natural resources are worth $3.5 trillion. That's more than 70 times the amount of foreign aid it receives each year. And in fact, $3.5 trillion is probably an underestimate. As you know, the petroleum frontier has shifted south from the Middle East to West Africa. Central Africa is rich in everything from gold to the coltan that's used in those mobile phones you just switched to silent. Southern Africa has bountiful reserves of precious stones. So to help developing nations make better use of natural resources, a group of ex-politicians and entrepreneurs working with academics like Paul have proposed a natural resources charter, which they hope will be adopted by governments, businesses and NGOs. The charter offers practical ways in which governments can ensure that people get a better deal. And Australia, I'm glad to say, financially supports the charter. First, the charter proposes that financial flows be fully transparent. As I've noted, mining generates relatively few jobs, so what happens to the royalties or the profits is critical. And through the Publish What You Pay campaign and the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, whose conference many of you will be attending later in the week, mining companies, and that includes the 230 Australian mining companies currently operating in Africa are encouraged to release information about the payments they make to government. Australia is committed to promoting anti-corruption activities internationally. We're a supporter of the UN Conventions Against Corruption and the OECD Conventions on combating bribery of foreign public officials and guidelines for multinational enterprises. Australia is involved in the Anti-Corruption Initiative for Asia and the Pacific. We financially support the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, and that allows citizens to pressure governments into spending their money on infrastructure, such as hospitals, schools, roads. And I stress that we should apply initiatives such as this practically, collecting information to ensure transparent governance while acknowledging that resources belong to entire nations and that wealth is spread accordingly. We must ensure that governments and their people are in the best position to benefit from resource development through strong and transparent legislation and adequately trained staff who apply regulations, such as the terrific group of Afghanistan public servants I enjoyed speaking to this morning. It means ensuring communities are engaged through planning, development and closure, and governments are informed on how best to use revenues. Second, the Charter argues that extraction rights should be sold by auction. Once you've got a handful of bidders participating, it becomes difficult for them to collude, and the final price is likely to reflect what the rights are actually worth. Paul uses an example of the UK, which was right on the verge of negotiating a deal to sell their mobile phone spectrum for £2 billion when it was persuaded to try an auction instead. And the auction raised not £2 billion, but £22 billion. And so, as Paul puts it, his pitch to developing countries is straightforward. If the UK Treasury can get it wrong by a factor of 10, what makes you think you're going to do better? As an economist, I firmly believe that if there's uncertainty over the value of an asset, such as a greenfields mining licence, an auction is the best way of ensuring it garners a fair price. I wouldn't sell my own house without an auction, so it's not clear to me why one should sell a valuable greenfields mining lease any other way. An Australian history points to the importance of fairly allocating natural resources. There's a recent article in the Journal of Economic Perspectives where Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson compare the Australian experience of gold prospecting in the 19th century with that of Sierra Leone's experience with alluvial diamonds in the 20th century. 19th century Australian gold mining allocated mining rights in small lots, and the effect of that was to spread the lottery, if you like, of gold prospecting. It ended up generating a pro-democratic force, thanks to the Eureka Stockade and subsequent events. By contrast, diamonds in Sierra Leone were exclusively mined by the Sierra Leone Selection Trust, which had its own security force. And as Acemoglu and Robinson argue, the scene was set for the creation of one-party and authoritarian rule after independence in 1961. Third, the Charter suggests that developing country governments should maximise the amount of information about a country's subsoil assets. If governments or aid donors conduct geological surveys and make them publicly available, then the people of that nation are more likely to get a fair share of their natural resources. Now, the International Mining for Development Centre at the University of Queensland and the University of Western Australia is not just our hosts for today. A core aim of that centre is to improve the quality of geological surveys in developing nations. And another way of increasing the information is to require that auction winners begin prospecting within a fixed period of time. If one miner strikes it lucky, that'll raise the sale price when nearby parcels are auctioned off. The thing that really strikes me about good management of the mining sector is how many of the challenges are truly global. So the Australian Department of Resources, Energy and Tourism have partnered with AusAid to share some of the lessons of the Australian mining experience. The Department of Resources, Energy and Tourism has recently held workshops in China, India, Indonesia, Mexico and Peru. The Sustainability Program receives support at the national and state level by the Mineral Council on Mineral and Petroleum Resources and by the Minerals Council of Australia. The Minerals Council maintains its own Australian minerals industry framework on sustainable development, known as Enduring Values. And that complements the International Council on Mining and Metals' 10 Principles for Sustainable Development, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. I want to stress here that we don't have all the answers, but we're keen to be a part of the conversation. Currently, at a local level, Australia is working with African government counterparts to provide technical expertise in the minerals resource sector, trade policy, public sector reform and private sector development. We're working through the Australian African Partnership Facility, Australian Development Scholarships and the Australia African Fellowships Program, supporting the establishment of the African Minerals Development Centre to help build capacity in governments and institutions across that continent. We also have a strong focus on helping the world's mining industry improve its safety record. Mining is hazardous work. Yeah, there's some of that coltan at work there. Mining's hazardous work, and too many people have died worldwide extracting natural resources. Our efforts in this regard include the Australia-China Coal Mine Safety Demonstration Project, which showcases mine safety technology and adopts leading practices to minimise mine injuries and fatalities. Delegates, Australia stands willing and able to help other countries however we can, whether through efforts to improve the lot of Indigenous communities, ensure protection of the environment and worker safety, or improve governance. But we can achieve nothing without cooperation and communication within and between the global mining and development sectors. That's what makes events such as this and the upcoming Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative conference so important. So I'd encourage you to follow up with AusAid, Department of Resources, Energy and Tourism, and if you need a political slant, my colleague Kirsten Livermore, to learn about Australian efforts that interest you. With your help, we can turn the old resource curse into a new resource blessing and ensure that mining boosts living standards across the globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew Lee. That was indeed a great opening presentation and spoken from a clear depth of expertise and some passion. Thank you. Now, can I invite our opening panel up onto the stage, Peter Baxter, Mark Lowcock, Ume Waineti and Paul Collier. Take a seat. And we are going to hear from this diverse range of eminent speakers, and then we will have 20 minutes or so at the end to ask them some probing questions. So as you're listening to these speakers, please do think about what points you would like to raise and what questions you would like to ask. Andrew, just thank you very much. Andrew has to go and do something else now with the stock exchange. Now, our first speaker in this session is Mr. Peter Baxter, who is the Director General of AusAid. And AusAid, of course, is a very important partner to IM4DC and provides our funding. Prior to joining AusAid, Peter Baxter was in charge of Consular, Public Diplomacy and Parliamentary Affairs Division in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, a department he joined in 1988 and served in a number of overseas postings, including Fiji, the Solomon Islands and Vietnam. Peter's most recent posting was as Deputy Chief of Mission in Washington, DC, USA, from 2002 to 2005. But prior to that, in 2000, Peter was appointed as Special Envoy of the Foreign Minister to the Solomon Islands, and we're honoured to have a number of people, senior representatives from the Solomon Islands, here with us today. Please welcome Mr. Peter Baxter.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the honour of being able to address this group. I'd also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to the elders, both past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of elected representatives from Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, the Pacific, and of course Australia, as well as leaders from civil society, academia and industry. I'm very happy that all of you have been able to join us today. I'm particularly happy that we've been able to convene this conference with our great partners, the University of Western Australia and the University of Queensland, who make up the International Mining for Development Centre. As head of the agency responsible for Australia's Mining for Development initiative, I'd certainly like to welcome you all to the second annual Mining for Development conference. And I'd like to talk a little bit about why we have a Mining for Development program. And in doing so, I'll build on some of the remarks that Parliamentary Secretary Lee has just made. But to set the context, in 1999, over a third of people in low and middle income countries were living in extreme poverty. The latest data shows that figure is now 20%. This equates to 750 million fewer people in places like China, India and Brazil and Indonesia living on less than $1.25 a day, the internationally accepted definition of extreme poverty. Between 1988 and 2008, the percentage of China's population living in extreme poverty fell from 48% to 13%. A change in the lives of 420 million people. Closer to Australia, in Indonesia, 52 million people, or more than twice the population of Australia, moved out of extreme poverty between 1999 and 2009. And by far the biggest contributor to this reduction in poverty has been economic reform that allows the private sector to flourish and growth to occur. People escape poverty when they find work, and we know that the private sector is responsible for creating around 90% of all jobs in developing countries. And when people have jobs and stable incomes, they consume more, they invest more, and they pay more tax. And taxes collected by governments can then be used to provide education and health services, to build and maintain infrastructure, and reinvested in a more resilient economy. Matching this growth in emerging economies and the movement of hundreds of millions of people out of poverty has been a boom in the demand for natural resources on a scale that's never been seen before. To use the example of China again, in the year 2000, 215,000 new motor cars were sold domestically in China. Last year, the figure was 19 million, making China's vehicle market larger than America and Japan combined. And this growth in demand has seen the prices of commodities such as iron ore, coal and copper increase substantially. The IMF's metal price index has increased more than threefold since 2000. And in turn, this has driven a huge expansion of the mining sector from traditional resource-producing countries like Australia and Canada into Africa, Latin America and Southeast Asia. Developing countries' share of world trade in minerals has been steadily increasing from less than a third in the year 2000 to nearly half in 2010. During this period, the developing economies of Asia have increased their share of global mining exports from 16% to 23%. And the value of mining exports from all developing countries has almost tripled. So developing nations are becoming key to providing raw materials for global prosperity. Just as important, however, the revenue from these raw materials offers huge prospects for poverty reduction. If managed well, This revenue and the investment in infrastructure, jobs, skills and support services created by extractives projects has the potential to move communities, regions and even entire countries out of poverty. And the scale of this poverty-reducing capacity of the mining sector is immense. For example, the revenue that governments collect from taxes and royalties dwarf those from aid. In 2009, African natural resource exports were worth $246 billion, and that's 6 times greater than the total aid from all donors combined going to Africa. In Mongolia, the development of one mining project, Oyu Tolgoi, is expected to directly increase GDP by 25.6% by 2020. And in Papua New Guinea, in 2011, mining and petroleum accounted for 74% of Papua New Guinea's merchandise exports, 19% of gross domestic product, and 25% of the central government's internally sourced revenue. But unlike other sectors, natural resources such as oil, gas, minerals and metals are finite, whether it be 5 years or 50 years. Natural resource wealth is fleeting. The transformative impact of extractives comes from maximising the returns and the sensible investment of revenues. But this is not easy. It requires governments to carefully manage each link of the extractives chain. This includes establishing a transparent framework for awarding exploration and production licences, regulating extractives operations and monitoring their compliance with social and environmental safeguards, and establishing royalty and taxation regimes that encourage investment while ensuring that governments get a good deal for their non-renewable resources. Distributing that revenue fairly and in a way that supports sustainable development, particularly from communities impacted by extractive projects, and establishing mechanisms for managing revenues that promote broad-based economic growth. History has shown that most countries struggle with one or more of these links. Given their interconnectedness, this can lead to failure across the whole sector. In his speech, Parliamentary Secretary Lee spoke of Australia's credentials in mining as a country with more than 150 years of experience, a highly skilled workforce and home to some of the biggest mining companies in the world. Australia is a country that has successfully managed to harness its mineral wealth for long-term sustainable benefits. We're a world leader in mining, and we want to use our aid program to share our experiences, our knowledge and our skills with others. This then is why Australia's aid program supports mining for development. Because mining is happening anyway. The demand for natural resources is driving unprecedented investment in operations in developing countries, which will only increase in the long term. Because when well managed, the transformative potential of this investment to boost private sector activity and reduce poverty is immense. And because as a country with a long-standing mining history, there is much we have learnt that we can share. And critically, we support mining for development because there is strong demand for Australia's assistance from our partner countries. Our Mining for Development initiative is only 18 months old, but already we're starting to see results. For instance, an AusAid short course participant from West Africa learned how resource companies could transfer pricing to avoid paying tax. So when he returned home, he initiated the re-auditing of 3 companies that saved the country over $21 million. This equates to half the running cost of that country's Ministry of Education for a year. A mines inspector from Ghana learned about large volume waste management while participating in a study tour delivered by the International Mining for Development Centre. And when he returned home, he revised Ghana's annual mine safety audit requirements to include waste management facilities which had not previously been included in the audit process. And in Indonesia, the International Mining for Development Centre is working with the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources to train an additional 1,000 mines inspectors. and these inspectors will improve environmental and occupational health and safety standards across the Indonesian mining sector. In each case, a small but strategic investment by AusAid to support the efforts of our partners looks set to have a big impact on the sustainability of partner countries' mining sectors. As you all know, later this week, Australia will host the 6th Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative Global Conference. This is the first time the conference has been held in the Southern Hemisphere, and many of us will also attend that conference. Australia is a strong supporter of EITI's work. We believe that greater transparency will result in positive outcomes for communities in developing countries, and that is why financial support to EITI is one of the cornerstones of our Mining for Development initiative. All of which leads me to why we're here today. We want to focus this conference on the people most affected by mining operations, the women, men and children who live on and near the land from which natural resources are sourced. We want to use this conference to add to the global conversation about how to ensure that these people receive the full benefit and maximum opportunity from mining. Over the next 2 days, we'll hear from a range of people on these issues. These will include representatives of communities, including women's groups, where the impacts of mining are felt most acutely. We will also hear from eminent academics and heads of industry, senior officials and ministers. We are bringing together this week some of the world's top minds on mining for development and a range of experiences which showcase some leading-edge thinking in maximising poverty reduction through mining. We want to use the conference to build new partnerships between countries, between communities and national governments, and between the mining industry and the communities they serve. I'm convinced that the mining industry can play a critical part in reducing poverty across the world. My hope is that this conference will assist in ensuring that the maximum number of poor people can benefit from mining. And looking around the room at the eminent people that are present here today, I'm sure this is something that we can achieve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter Baxter. Plenty of food for thought there, and already some good news coming out of efforts in mining for development. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Mark Lowcock, who is the Permanent Secretary of the Department for International Development in the UK, otherwise known as DFID. Mark Lowcock joined DFID in 1985, which means he has enormous depth of experience in one of the world's largest development assistance programs run by DFID. The roles he has held within and close to DFID include as Private Secretary to Baroness Chalker, the Minister for Overseas Development in the early 90s, Deputy Head and latterly Head of the DFID Regional Office for Central Africa, Head of the DFID Regional Office for East Africa, and then he got a desk job, and he's done a range of roles within DFID back in the UK. Most recently, Director General of Policy and International, and then Director General of Country Programs from 2008 until 2011, when he was appointed Permanent Secretary. I'm looking forward to hearing from Mark Lowcock. No doubt you are too. Mark, please make him welcome.
Thank you. Ian, thank you very much indeed. I want first to congratulate the Government of Australia, and especially my friends and colleagues in AusAid, for their initiative in hosting this event. This is a set of subjects that you know more about than many of us, and Australia especially knows about how to develop its mining resources well. You're not just a leader in successfully exporting your mineral commodities, you're a leader in doing it sustainably, thinking about the impact on local communities and thinking about the natural environment. I dare say you've had to manage some of the risks that go with this as well. I did wonder as I confronted the price of my morning cup of coffee this morning, whether exchange rate appreciation was one of those risks. But you will be pleased to hear, Peter, that I've just concluded that you have spectacularly good coffee here, and that's what accounts for the price. I want to cover the challenges countries face in exploiting their mineral resources and what organisations like mine can do to help. I do have a full text, and I stand by every word of it, and it will be on my Twitter account shortly. But actually, some of the points I wanted to make have already been made by Mr. Lee and by Peter, so I will try and summarise the key additional points. My own country, the UK, is one whose development has been spurred by natural resources. Our industrial revolution 200 years ago saw the emergence of the great cities of Lancashire and the Midlands, scores of factories and mills, thousands of miles of canals and roads and railways. It was driven by the genius of our inventors and by our heritage as a seafaring and trading nation, but it was fueled by coal. Easy to mine, cheap to transport because our mines were near the sea and our inland waterways, easy to use. The Industrial Revolution saw a 100-fold increase in coal production, Britain's coal boom, literally fueling the development of the world's first industrial economy. Early in my career as a young development professional in the mid-1980s, the received wisdom was that a few of the poorest countries in which my organisation worked were luckily endowed with mineral opportunities, but that many were not. So I was sent to Quetta in Pakistan in 1988 to look at a fluorite mining and exploration program that we had financed and to try to understand why it hadn't delivered the goods. I was then sent later that year to La Paz in eastern Bolivia, where we, through the British Geological Survey, had spent 10 years producing world-class geological and survey maps in the hope of finding big new deposits of gold and other minerals. But unfortunately, that program did not develop major new mining opportunities. What's happened, though, is that with soaring global demand and ever better technology, it's now clear that extractives can, in fact, be a much bigger part of the development story for more of the poorest countries than some people thought a generation ago. Prices are perhaps come off their frothy levels of 2 or 3 years ago, but demand still remains very robust, and prices are still, despite coming off the top, high by historical standards. And so what's now clear is that the number of countries with plausible plans for developing extractives is much bigger than we thought. There are plenty in this region, many in Asia. In fact, the majority of Africa's 55 countries have non-trivial mineral opportunities. This has important implications for organisations like mine. Our role is to help countries grow and develop to the point where they no longer need aid and they can sustain their own economies and deal with their own poverty problem. And in recent times, that's been a very successful endeavour. Many countries in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia, over the last generation have graduated from aid, and we now have an opportunity of achieving the same across many of today's least developed countries, and extractives are a really important part of that story. So the big questions for me are, first, how are countries with new extractive opportunities going to make a success of them? And second, what can development agencies do to help? The Africa Progress Panel, which is a high-level group chaired by Kofi Annan and including African leaders like President Obasanjo of Nigeria and Graça Machel, as well as leading African business figures like Strive Masiyiwa and Tidjane Thiam, earlier this month published an important set of answers to those questions. If you haven't read their report, I really commend it to you. They set out detailed recommendations which are applicable not just to Africa, but universal. There may be some people who cavil at some of the detail of the recommendations, but I doubt there's anyone who disagrees with the broad thrust. Kofi and his team make the point that most countries endowed with minerals need capital and expertise from international investors to develop them. Given that it's now clear that many more countries have valuable endowments, that means investors have choices. So a lot of countries have to work out how to be attractive to investors. The panel say that the key to managing non-renewable resources successfully is a coherent long-term national strategy, embracing all stakeholders that can convert temporary natural resources wealth into permanent human capital that can expand opportunities across the generations. And they identify 5 main components. Firstly, an enduring contract between governments and citizens sustaining the highest standards of transparency and accountability. Secondly, ensuring that benefits are distributed sustainably across society, both by spending on basic services, but also by putting in place the infrastructure and skills that are needed to foster inclusive growth. Thirdly, progressively strengthening the linkages between the extractive sector and local markets, so you maximize value added. Fourthly, by developing resources in a way that protects and benefits host communities and safeguards the natural environment. And fifth, by providing civil society groups with the political space to monitor what's going on, including in contracts and concessions and licensing agreements. Unfortunately, too often this prescription has been ignored. Benefits have been scooped by elites wanting to use them to build dynasties, but having the effect of breeding resentment and distrust and ultimately instability. That rarely turns out to be a winning formula, certainly in the long run. The Annan report makes important recommendations for the international community, as well as suggestions for how development agencies can help. They call on the G8 to take the lead on a new agenda on tax disclosure and transparency. We agree with that. In the summit that we're going to host in the UK next month, we will put the focus on the development of open economies, open governments, and open societies. And in 3 big areas, we will contribute to an improvement in the management of the extractives opportunity. Advancing trade, firstly. Secondly, ensuring tax compliance, especially making progress on the vexed issue of beneficial ownership. And thirdly, on promoting greater transparency. Mr. Lees and Peter mentioned the EITI. We have invested in the UK in EITI from the beginning. It's great to see Australia hosting the global conference this week. It's great also that EITI now has 37 member countries. I'm sure by the end of the week there'll be more. EITI has helped to entrench an expectation of transparency and demonstrated how business and governments and citizens can work together to deliver change. I think the revised standard will further enhance and strengthen EITI's role. But in order to lift millions of people out of poverty, and let's remember that that is the primary aim of EITI set out in its charter, we need to find ways to make sure that transparency and accountability are the norm everywhere. And that's why my Prime Minister, David Cameron, has called on G8 members to put their own houses in order, as well as encouraging others to emulate high standards of transparency. Last month, the European Union took the historic step of requiring companies in the extractive sector to report their payments to all governments project by project, matching the rules that are already in operation in the US. At the G8, we want to level the playing field for business and make progress towards common global reporting standards by encouraging more countries to adopt that set of rules. That'll help fight corruption, strengthen the investment climate, and spur economic growth. Some people, including some of the blue chip international investors, also think there should be contract disclosure. I know that as Australia takes on leadership through the presidency of the G20 later this year, you'll be considering how to shape this agenda. The G8 and the G20, of course, are different bodies with different remits, but we very much hope that you will be able to take forward this work during your leadership, not least given your expertise in this key sector. We're also keen to ensure that the new wave of information on oil and gas and minerals is actually accessible to citizens and investors and governments, all those people who really need it, in a way that they can use it. For those of you who will still be here in Sydney on Wednesday evening, I invite you to come to the Powerhouse Museum and hear more about the innovative work that we're supporting to inspire new data storytellers. You can follow that conversation on Twitter as well. #FollowTheData. The African Progress Panel also makes a series of recommendations for donors, organisations like mine, to help build the capacity of governments to manage their resources well. And I'd like to just run through 5 ways in which we in DFID have been responding to that. Firstly, we've financed advice and expertise at the request of countries thinking of setting up sovereign wealth funds or worried about how to handle the macroeconomic challenges created by rapid development of mineral resources. The International Growth Centre, funded by DFID but operating independently, offers world-class demand-driven analysis and policy advice. It's run out of the London School of Economics and Oxford University. Paul can tell you more about it. It currently has 13 offices across the developing world. It's provided policy advice on the mineral tax regime in Zambia, on mining licenses in Sierra Leone, and on an economic framework for natural resource management in Liberia. We're also supporting countries with the establishment of social protection systems, which are an efficient way of ensuring that natural resources wealth is shared across society, in particular as an alternative to fuel and other subsidies, which are often both inefficient and subject to abuse. One of the most gripping stories I followed over the last year or so has been the effort of the Nigerian government and the Nigerian National Assembly to clean up a multi-billion-dollar abuse of the fuel subsidy scheme. Checks have been put in place, auditors sent to the ports, and claims where no evidence of importation of product existed have been refused. What was probably Africa's biggest corruption scam was stopped. Had the subsidy arrangement not existed, of course, that particular scam wouldn't have been possible. Secondly, we've been asked for help in a range of countries, including Malawi and Sierra Leone, to put in place appropriate legislation to develop mineral resources and to build the capacity to negotiate effectively so that concessions and licenses work both for the investors and for the host country. Sometimes multilateral agencies are best placed to do that, as with the World Bank's ProMine program in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which we help co-finance. We also have capacity and expertise in the UK on geological surveying and mapping. We're exploring with the World Bank and the British Geological Survey how to integrate geological data across countries into a common digitalized platform. That should make geological data accessible to governments and citizens and potential investors now and in the future. And by combining that data with other important information on infrastructure or the environment, it should make it easier for governments to integrate concession allocation for mining into wider economic, social, and environmental planning. It's fantastic to see Minister Sharani here from Afghanistan. We're working with his geological survey, environmental geology section to strengthen their ability to manage that aspect of the development of the resources, as well as to help with contract management and inspectorate functions, including supporting an independent audit. Thirdly, we provide expertise on tax policy and administration. This is an area in which more international collaboration is needed. We are building new capability in Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which is our tax authority, to make our tax experts available to help their peers in developing countries. The first 3 programs will be in South Africa, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, and there are more to follow. Fourth, we've been asked by investors and national and local governments in some places to help develop economic opportunities for local people and communities on the back of mining ventures. So, for example, we've got some interesting work advancing in Tet province in Mozambique, home to one of the world's largest coal projects now under development. And fifthly, we can work with private investors to increase the development impact of their projects. Investors often have long time horizons on major extractives projects, and so they want a stable and predictable environment. They want host governments to be able to put in place arrangements which make it easier for those companies with the highest standards to operate in difficult places. So there is a lot at stake for governments, investors, the international community, but above all for citizens in how the current mineral supercycle plays out. Unfortunately, there are as many, maybe even more, stories of things going wrong as of things going right at the moment. If this conference can help turn that round, you will have been very successful. I agree with those people who think that this century could be Africa's century and the century of other low-income, least developed countries. There's 3 or 4 issues which will determine whether that's how this century plays out. How you develop your extractive resources will be one of them. So good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark Lowcock. And as Mark went through the things that DFID are working with their partners on, I was mentally ticking off some excellent opportunities for collaboration and cooperation. And that might give you a clue to at least one question at the end. Now, back to the core of our theme, maximising benefits for communities. And we're very privileged to have Ume Waineti from Papua New Guinea. Ume is the National Program Coordinator of the Family and Sexual Violence Action Committee in Papua New Guinea. And as Ume's role will give you an idea, not all of the benefits of mining are being realised, and there are some things, as Mark just said, more things going wrong. Some things going wrong, some things are going right. I think Ume may talk to us about some of those things that do go wrong, particularly with communities as a result of some of the economic activity and wealth that's generated by mining, and also some community disruption. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Ume. Before she became the National Program Coordinator for the Family and Sexual Violence Action Committee, she has worked in roles in the Women's Program, as Women's Program Officer in the Prime Minister's Office, General Secretary of the Papua New Guinea National Council of Women, and Projects Officer with the Office of Village Development in the Department of Prime Minister. She's also worked on the ground as counsellor and social worker. So Ume has a wonderful experience both at policy level, but very importantly at the community level. Please make Ume welcome.
Let me add to what everyone has said before me. Welcome, everybody, and thank you, organizers, for this honor to welcome me to come here to express my humble opinion on what I see happening. And what I talk about will not be about other mines in Papua New Guinea, but the mine that I am directly involved with because I am a woman from Western Province, and that is the Oktedi mine. And I don't stand here as the National Program Coordinator for Family and Sexual Violence. I stand here as my people know me, as my first name is Sibayo. I stand here as Sibayo, as a woman who comes from Dudi Trust. The trusts that have been established under the CMCA, and I belong to one of the trust areas, and so that's Dudi Trust. My uncle is the chairman of the trust, of Dudi Trust. I was asked to talk on, the whole theme of this conference is to look at maximizing benefits for communities. And I was especially asked to talk on responding to fast-changing community expectations and aspirations. When I was looking at that topic, I asked myself, how do you ask communities, especially in Tabubil, who are eating human flesh at the time when Mount Fubulem was identified, was found with all that wealth there? How do you ask men and women who are feeding on flesh, what is their expectation and aspirations for development for mine to bring? None. That was in 1971-72 when they were brought down to Daru and to Port Moresby, and people were asked. At that time, there were a lot of jokes told because some of them were in jail, the landowners who came to Port Moresby, and because when magistrate asked one of those who was in jail while he ate human meat, he said, "That's the best meat you can eat." So such simple societies are now being targeted because that's where resources are. And now, a couple of years ago, the man who was Australian, who was chairman of the SDP, made this comment that some of the poorest people he has seen were those in the impacted areas, the corridors of Fly River. And today we are now looking at how do you get development, this cash, to these poorest people he was talking about. I told you that where the mines in many parts of Papua New Guinea is going to, mines are being opened, the communities are very primitive. Now, when we live in such primitive existence, all we know is what is around us. We survive on the environment that we have. We fish, we build our houses, we do all these things on the environment that we live in. And this is especially harvested by women. When government negotiates with a people and a company for land to be acquired. And in the case of Tabubil, people have to be relocated off the mines site. They have to build homes for these people to move to stay in. And you're moving primitive people to live in these homes that they have never, ever lived in those type of homes before. You expect them to change, to develop within a blink of an eye. These are the type of people we are talking about in Papua New Guinea. Many of these women, when I went to Tabubil, I used to see women walking with children to the shop, only shop that is owned by steamships. They walk there to buy corn and Coke for breakfast. They can't now live on their land because the land is taken up by the mine. I witnessed a TV documentary where recently China has taken over, is developing nickel mine in Madang, Ramu, in the Ramu district. And the women were crying, asking this question of, now what am I going to do? Everything I have is here. Why am I being told to vacate the land that I have always lived in? Even old men were shown saying the same thing. So when we talk about the aspirations and expectation of our people in the mine sites, these are the hardships and difficulties that must be looked at. Men were asked, developers are coming, what will happen? Their first reaction was, oh, what's going to happen to our women? We have to hide them. Just that thinking right from the beginning is already marginalizing women. Let us hide them. We don't want other men to come and see them. We don't want other men to associate with them. Let us hide them. And because of this, we don't see women. And anyway, I told you that when these things are negotiated in these communities, the level of women's education, or even the men who are involved in these negotiations are such that women even have lesser chance of being involved in negotiations. Like I said, they want to hide us. So when you look at, if we are like that, and I'm not denying that there is cash being given to those who are impacted, who are landowners. Now, I stand here as a land user. They've categorized us into those because we are a patrilineal society. So my uncle, who is the chairman, he is considered landowner. I'm a land user. So, I'm allowed to use the land, but I don't own it. And that's different in other parts of Papua New Guinea where you have provinces like Bougainville, New Ireland, East New Britain, Milne Bay. We have matrilineal societies there, so the situation is different for women there. Even then, men usually take the lead in many of these things. And so when you look, when we are asking, especially in the case of Oktedi, whose expectations and aspirations we should be asking for, it was our government's. Our government's interest, the mine was serving. And so even when we had a couple of years later when there was a lot of dispute with landowners over environmental pollution, government actually took the lead to get people to sign the CMCAs, and those are the trust areas now we see. And it was not, and in this case, even then, these CMCAs were not signed by landowners. And even one government officer was laughing, telling me that anybody they found in the villages were asked to sign, even children. Each year, because there are no other services, no bank services, no shops, nothing in the corridors of the Fly River where these things are happening, you find that everybody, when it's time for monies to be given out, everybody flock into Daru Island. Now, with these type of things, there's a lot of other difficulties that women are going through. One is when they come to Daru, many of them find that they cannot survive there anymore. Because what can you do with 135 kina? Or 37 kina, less than 200 or just over 200 kina that is given to you in that quarter? You can't really live on it. It's a lot of money given, but when it's shared amongst individuals, each individual, it's not much to live on. To pay your school fees, to do anything else with it, it's not much. And so many women on the island sell firewood, even husbands prostitute them when they don't make enough money. Many of these women do not live to be 21 years old. They die before that time, that age. So looking at what the real situation is, what are our expectations? What do we want now to do to help? One important thing that has come out, and when it comes to negotiation, because of the type of people we're dealing with, it is important. It doesn't matter if it's a woman from the local area where the mine is going to be, but a women's voice must be heard at negotiation right from the beginning. somebody who is from that province or even from a women's national missionary should be involved to negotiate so that women's views are captured in the negotiation. And the other important thing that is missing is government actually putting some standards as to what they want the mines to deliver, to develop the people who are being affected directly by the mine. Some sort of standards that say, this is what we want to do, you as a mine management to do for education, for the health of the people, for their education. Because, you know, when I was at the negotiations for CMCAs, Mines Koktedi kept saying with SDP, education and health is not our business. That is supposed to be government business. They dissociate themselves from helping to develop the capacity and the welfare of the people. And one thing that we consciously have to move away from, which I keep seeing in mining areas, is that this thinking that we women are still welfare things to be done for. We teach them to cook, we teach them to sew, we teach them to be good mothers, to keep the homes. We need to start thinking of women's development in Papua New Guinea, in the mining area, as issues of development. I would like to acknowledge the women putting together when they had their first meetings in Papua New Guinea, women in mining, the plan that they developed, and later, after our negotiations in 2007, was refined to capture the sort of things I'm talking about that should be captured. And it's called, the document is called Women in Mining Action Plan. And this plan brings forward 12 basic things that need to be looked at for development for women. One is mobilizing and strengthening women's network to advocate and deliver services. Second is education and literacy to improve the status of women. And to ensure that because we you know, in Papua New Guinea, our husbands, we don't talk with our husbands and decide how many children we are going to have. We just have children. We just have children. So one of the things we say in that plan is that we need to have education on reproductive health and good family planning methods to be made available to us so that we're not being kept pregnant in the homes, at least we can do something. And good MCH services to be provided to our people. Because, you know, I have traveled extensively in Western Province. And, you know, I am sad to say this, that the mining things that are happening, even though one good thing SDP, I must acknowledge SDP for, is that it has connected us. And like I can talk to my auntie in the village from Mosby. You know, that digital network they have established for us is wonderful. We can talk. But a lot of other things that are happening is like we, the people, are remaining the spectators and they are doing things for us. And that's because we do not have the education nor the skills to participate. All we see is outside people coming in and being employed in our province. We ourselves are not part of it. We are not part of the development, so we do not directly benefit as for job opportunities from what is being offered there. And so most times we remain spectators and say, okay, oh yeah, they are doing this thing, they are doing this thing. And I believe that if people are able to participate and feel part of what is happening, then there'll be real change of attitude and we will see development. Yeah, going back to, and the plan, women's plan, also talks about actual awareness on HIV, on TB, things like that, information that need to be given out for women to be educated. It looked at food security, because now our environment is destroyed, we need to survive. So food security. Even being educated and having jobs to now in the impacted area in the Fly River is a means of food security and for our survival. The plan talks about even what should happen after the mine closes, and we don't know when it's going to close. It just keeps going and going and going. Income-generating activities for women, and just having an information source from where information is collected and disseminated so the communities are advised on what is happening. Some of the things that create a lot of problems and is contributing to other social issues that we are seeing, like selling of our young children. Lot of, I said before, our men want to hide us. And now we have this problem where a lot of unwanted children are born and are being sold, especially in the Kianga area, and we don't even know what happened to these children. One thing I was with them in March this year. It's our National Women's Day that government set aside to acknowledge women for what they've done, contribute to our country. And they questioned me, asking me, one of the grandmothers said to me, is it my right to sell my grandchild who I'm tired of looking after? And these are bigger social issues that have come out because of mine. People come and go. We don't really have no control over what is happening. So some of the things things government should do, our own PNG government should do and put in place is, one is probably addressing child labor, because we are now starting to have big problem with that. That companies coming, then, abide by those policies and regulate, what you call those things, legislations that government have, child rights, child labor, even having, sexual harassment policies in place, things like that, that are not there to protect women and children. Unless those type of minimum standards are put, and acknowledging that we do have a plan that need to be implemented, we are not going to go very far with the development things we're talking about. Even, we've got so much money now sitting there. The life for women since 2007 to now has not changed. It is the same. And I think it has gotten worse. Before I sit down, all I want to say is that I hope this conference will help us all to find a way to find solutions to help our people who are, instead of being empowered and their lives improved because of so much money, these people have become the poorest people in Papua New Guinea. Thank you very much.
Wow. What a great address from Ume to really help us focus on some of the things that need to be done and addressed if communities really are to benefit, and particularly disadvantaged people in the communities, as Ume identified, women, and also, surprise to me, children. So thank you, Ume. You have given us a great focus for the rest of this conference. I'm now pleased to introduce Professor Paul Collier, CBE, who is Professor of Economics and Public Policy at Blavatnik School of Government, and he's a Professorial Fellow at St Anthony's College at the University of Oxford. I'm sure all of you have at least heard of Paul Collier if you haven't downloaded his book books from Amazon, as I have. Paul has a deep experience in development policy. He has spent time between 1998 and 2003 as Director of the Research Development Department at the World Bank. He was awarded a CBE for Services to Development in 2008, and he remains as an advisor to the Strategy and Policy Department of the International Monetary Fund. Paul is regularly published in the global media. He's also an author of several excellent books, including The Bottom Billion, which provides an excellent reference source for thinking about some of the topics that we need to address in this conference over the next 2 days. Please welcome Paul Collier.
Well, I have some advice for future speakers. Do not follow Ume Wainetti. For that matter, don't follow Andrew Lee. Right? I've never felt so upstaged. But thank you very much for inviting me. This is the right topic in the right place at the right time. It's the right time because the last decade, the upside of the commodity supercycle, in the poorest countries, that was a decade of discovery. They were the least prospected areas on Earth, and so over the last decade, there was an enormous amount of investment in prospecting. Over the coming decade, so the last decade was a decade of discovery, the coming decade is going to be the decade of extraction. The stuff's been discovered, and over the coming decade, it will come out of the ground. And so, although commodity prices probably won't carry on up, and maybe it'll be a gentle slide down, the value of extraction from the poorest countries will carry on up and up. And so that's why it's the right time. Right? Let's get in place thinking just ahead of that decade of extraction. Andrew Lee went through the Natural Resource Charter, and the Natural Resource Charter is primarily pitched for governments and people in resource-rich poor countries. It's just a checklist of going through the whole decision chain from how you manage the discovery process through how you handle investment and revenues. So I don't want to cover that. Partly Andrew's already done it, and partly it's there in the Natural Resource Charter. Today I want to pitch my remarks basically to the companies, the mining companies, who are surely represented here today. And I just want to frame the question, what can mining companies do to help this process along? And because this area is often rather pious, I want to start with a very simple point, which is seldom made in environments like this, but it's really quite important. It's a point made by Adam Smith. He makes it related to butchers and bakers. And, there's a famous passage in Adam Smith where he says, well, actually, the butcher and the baker do best for society just by being good butchers and bakers, by looking after their own interest, and in the process, they help everybody else. And to a considerable extent, that's true also of mining companies. By being really world-class mining companies, with the best technologies, you are already in a position to do an awful lot for the poorest countries. You've already done that in the last decade of discovery, and you'll do it in the coming decade of extraction. So we start from a solid baseline of Adam Smith's insight that self-interest can be mutually beneficial. But now let's go beyond Adam Smith. And the starting point is CSR, corporate social responsibility, plain vanilla. And plain vanilla generally starts with sort of health and education programs. And I just want to give one little twist to that, which is that I think a mistake of the past was sometimes to conceive of health and education programs as projects in which you built a school, you built a clinic. Actually, the big resource of the resource extraction companies is not their money, it's their organizational competence. You are effective organizations, and in poor countries, the poorest countries, there is a terrible dearth of effective organizations. And you can turn that effectiveness to many different uses. You can even turn it to the clinics and the schools, which need to deliver not just a building, but quality healthcare, quality schooling. Let me give you an example of that from Ghana. And this is an example of Ashanti goldfields. Now, Ashanti goldfields operating in Ghana, gold mine, and they noticed that too many of their staff, their employees, were sick from malaria. So they thought, well, we better do something about it. It's actually costing us money having our staff, our workers sick with malaria all the time. So they realized that you can't just stop malaria for your own workers in the vicinity of the mine. It's a neighborhood problem. So they ran a neighborhood program to reduce malaria. And over the course of 4 years in that neighborhood, they brought the incidence of malaria down, not just for their workers, but for everybody else in the neighborhood, by about 70%. At which point, the Global Fund, which funds programs against malaria, noticed them and came along and said, we'll give you the money to do this for the whole of Ghana. And Ashanti Goldfields understandably said, well, actually, we're a gold mine, not a health ministry, so why don't you go and talk to the Ministry of Health? They could run an anti-malaria program. The Global Fund said, actually, we tried that, and it didn't work. Why don't you come with us to the Ministry of Health and see what they say? So that's what Ashanti did. It went along with the Global Fund to the Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Health said, Global Fund's quite right. We just haven't managed to be effective in bringing malaria down. You're obviously able to do it in your neighborhood. Will you do it for the whole country? Well, that's what they're doing. Right? Paid for by the Global Fund. It's not out of Ashanti Goldfields' profits, but it is harnessing Ashanti Goldfields' brilliant skills at delivering effective outcomes with their management, turned to a completely different use from its usual use of getting the gold out of the ground. Right? Now, is that a sensible thing for Ashanti Goldfields to do? It's certainly corporate social responsibility on steroids. I mean, it's a fantastic achievement. Is it a sensible thing for them to do? Let's think of two benefits to that company. Right? One is, suppose you were an employee of Ashanti Goldfields. How would you feel about getting up in the morning and going to work? Right? There's a great mantra at the moment amongst mining companies that the mission is to maximize shareholder value. Right? You'll hear chief executives say that to shareholders. Right? It might work with shareholders, it certainly doesn't work with employees. Nobody anywhere ever got up in the morning thinking, yes, today I'm going to maximize shareholder value. Right? Right? It's just not, that's not how life is, right? There's a little book on this by a famous writer called John Kay. The book's called Obliquity. And his point is that companies need to go for things obliquely, for the profit objective obliquely. He gives the example of Imperial Chemical Industries, which used to have the objective, we want to be the best chemical company in the world, and then sometime in the 1990s they switched to the corporate objective, we want to maximize shareholder value, at which point shareholder value started to tank and never recovered. Right? So my point is that just getting your own employee motivation, it's good to have something that your employees can feel truly proud of. And then, when Ashanti comes to tell this story to shareholders, what else can it say that's a bit reassuring? It can say, well, economists tell us that mining is a long-term business and you can never write a contract which anticipates everything that might happen in the next 50 years. Mining is intrinsically in the business of incomplete contracting. And so periodically, although we've got our contract with the government of Ghana, periodically over the next years, there'll be issues come up that are not specified, are not resolvable just from the contract. They'll depend how the government behaves. Well, next time there's some potential dispute between the government of Ghana and Ashanti Goldfields, guess how it's going to be resolved. It's more likely to go in a spirit of cooperation. Right? So that's plain vanilla corporate social responsibility, just with a little twist. Use your management expertise. That's your big resource, not just the money to build a building, to actually run these things properly. And now let's move to a more ambitious version of corporate social responsibility, ambitious but very necessary, and that is to move from thinking of yourselves as deliverers of welfare to deliverers of economic opportunity. And clearly that's what ordinary people want. And there are opportunities both in upstream activities and downstream activities from the natural resource itself. And let me start with upstream activities. So the inputs that are used by the resource extraction company. And here I'm going to pass on an insight, which is not my own. It's someone called John Sutton, who's the most eminent professor of industrial economics in Britain. He was head of economics at the London School of Economics. And John Sutton says, if there's one thing that resource extraction companies might do that would be really, really beneficial to societies, it's adopt a couple of small, medium, local companies who are supplying inputs, adopt them, and work with them over the years to build their capacities, to turn them from small companies that don't operate at world standards to serious companies that do operate at world standards. In the process of doing that, you'll build a grateful partner in your business, but you'll also be building companies of which the country can be proud of. And this is something that national governments in poor countries around the world naturally want, is to have indigenous companies that actually meet world standards. So partnering, and again, it's the same point. Your biggest skill is so apparent that you're not even aware of it because you live it day by day. Your biggest skill is your effective organizations, and you're operating in environments which just lack them. And so both delivering services yourself because you're an effective organization and growing other organizations, turning them into effective organizations, this can be really valuable. So that's the upstream potential for spreading productivity. Let me turn to the downstream. And the downstream potential for raising economic opportunities around the country comes especially from the infrastructure that mining typically puts in place. Mining needs Typically, it will need railways, it will need ports, it will need power. You can build these things just for yourselves. They can be dedicated, exclusive use. But if you design them properly, they can actually be multi-user, multi-function. So the same railway that takes the ore out of the country can also be planned with enough stations along the way that it can pick up agricultural produce and open up a whole development corridor. The rail can be planned like that, so can the port. The power that the mine needs can be shared at least with industrial users, maybe with local communities. So, upstream opportunities, downstream opportunities. I've been working with one of the great Australian mining companies over the last couple of years, and they've indeed seen the light, as I would think, and now have adopted as a matter of policy the idea that infrastructure should normally be designed to be multi-user and multi-function. And I think that's a major step forward. One of the things that persuaded them was that they were worried where was going to be their constituency of support in the future, given that, as Andrew himself said, mining directly is not going to employ very many people. It's going to be so capital intensive. And so if there are few people directly working for the mine, where are the people in the country who say that this mine is really important to us? And it's all the people dependent upon the infrastructure. And finally, let me turn to the most demanding aspect of CSR. It's that CSR in extractives has to be, unfortunately, more demanding than corporate social responsibility in other sectors of the economy, such as manufacturing. And there's a brutal economic reason for that. And that is that what mining companies take out of the ground, although accountants will lump it all into profit, it's actually two different things. It's profits plus rents. Profits are return on capital and risk and management competence. The rents are the intrinsic value of the natural asset once removed from the ground. Now, the profits rightly belong to the company, subject to normal rates of profits tax. But the rents rightly belong to the citizens of the country. And so, in a sense, the resource extraction company is a custodian of those rents that belong to citizens. As such, resource extraction companies are special. They're custodians of the natural assets of others, and that's a bit analogous to banks. So resource extraction companies, because you're managing other people's assets as well as generating profits, you're less like a manufacturing company and more like a bank. Now, we've learnt the hard way that banks need regulation, because if you let unregulated entities look after other people's assets, some of them don't do it very well. You might have noticed. And the same argument actually applies to resource extraction. Now, in Africa, where I work, the typical African government labours under two really severe burdens in trying to claim ownership and possession of these rents. One is the asymmetry between the information that the companies have and the information that the government has. Andrew described that. There are a couple of ways to narrow the gap. One is get public geological information. It's a very good way of reducing the information asymmetry. Another is auctions, which flush out, they reveal true value. A third way is for resource extraction companies actually to, before deals are struck, they try and train governments in negotiating and in understanding true value. Because responsible companies find this huge asymmetry of information between themselves and governments simply intolerable. Responsible companies find it intolerable, and irresponsible companies find it an opportunity. So, information asymmetry is one of the burdens. The other burden is what economists euphemistically call agency problems, which is that the public officials who are agents for their citizens are easily induced not to follow the interests of citizens by unscrupulous companies. And just put yourself in the place of an ill-paid official with a lot of dependent relatives and see the ethical dilemma when you're offered what to you is enormous amounts of money. And so, although there's a lot of finger-wagging at African governments about corruption, actually that is precisely the wrong point at which to try and clean corruption up. Those officials are faced with genuine ethical dilemmas, and the challenge is to stop them being faced by those dilemmas, not to lecture them on how bad they are. And so the right places to intervene are actually upstream of that, to make it much harder for companies to bribe and much harder for money to be laundered. One of the African governments I advise is facing both of these problems in spades. It's got this huge information asymmetry, and it appears to have been the victim of agency problems. You may have followed it in the press. Certainly the agent for one company is under criminal arrest by the FBI at the moment. Of course, it can't be up to companies to correct these problems. It has to be a matter for global rules. And so the vital thing for good companies, of course you will be good yourselves. You'll be good yourselves because your corporate ethics demands it. But the challenge is to make that general across your competitors. If you don't, you will be severely disadvantaged. And of course, that's the position of Australian companies at the moment. Some of the most transparent companies on earth, not just in resource extraction, but across the whole face of industry, are the major Australian resource extraction companies. And they face competition from companies at the very other end of the spectrum. Your companies can't deal with that, but your governments can. I'm proud to say that the British-led G8 is trying to do that at the moment. Prime Minister Cameron has actually asked me to advise on the development agenda for the G8, and that is the agenda we're trying to promote. Transparency and extractives, tightening up on corporate tax evasion, which is a huge hole in African government finances, and trying to tighten up on beneficial ownership to prevent money laundering. The G8 will make a start, but the problems of these three problems are the result of many years' work by some of the cleverest minds on earth who've been paid to come up with clever ways of tax avoidance and of the concealment of beneficial ownership. It will therefore take more than one G8 next month to fix the problem. The G8 can start the process. It will take some years. And that's why I'm not just dealing with the right topic, but in the right place at the right time, because who's taking over the G20 next year? You are. Thank you very much.
Well, this morning we have heard, including Andrew Lee, 5 excellent addresses and some very thought-provoking addresses from, in particular, Ume and Paul. Unfortunately, there won't be time for a Q&A session in this particular session. You will have time in following sessions, but if you're quick in the foyer, I'm sure the people in front of you would be pleased to talk with you and share their experience and answer your questions. So, in closing, please join me in thanking our excellent panellists today.